Hi, this is Brian Smith. In this video I'm going to cover the basics of the for loop, which is a critical point to understand when you're scripting in Linux or Unix. And also the for loop is very useful just for day-to-day use where you're writing ad hoc one-line commands on the command line to make things faster when you're trying to automate tasks you're doing on a day-to-day basis. So let's start by looking at an example of what a for loop is. Okay, so the for loop, they start out with the keyword for, and basically what's going to happen is the code between the for and the done is going to be run multiple times, once per each item in the list here. So in this example, the for loop will be run 4 times for each of these 4 items I've highlighted. Now the word after for here, you put a variable name. And so basically each time through the code here between the for and the done, this block of code will be run, and the user variable, each time it runs through, will be set the first time to the first item in the list, the second time to the second item, and so on. So basically, with this example here, since we have 4 items in our list, the code here will be run 4 times. The first time, the user variable will be set to test1. The second time, the user variable will be set to test2, and so on for test3 and test4. So, and you can see in the code here, in the block in this example, we're saying, we're displaying on the screen that we're in the for loop, and that the user variable equals whatever it currently equals. And then we can say echo, we're running the command id $user, and then we'll run id $user, and then the echo here will just put a blank line. So basically, the ID command, if you're not familiar, that just shows what groups a user's in. So let's go ahead and run this and see what happens. Okay, you can see the for loop ran 4 times, 1, 2, 3, 4. Each time we can see the user variable was set to, test1, test2, test3, test4, which corresponds right here to what we had in the list, test1, test2, test3, test4. And each time the ID command was run and shows the attributes for that user. Alright, let's look at another example here. Okay, so this shows that this is very similar to the last one, but in this case the list of items that we want to go over in the loop is contained in a file. So we're doing for user in, and then we put in backticks cat user. What this will do is, when the shell runs this, it'll cat what's in this file and substitute the list of what's in this file as items to be run in the loop here. So that what this is showing is you don't have to list out the things right here on in your for loop. You can have an external command return a list. So in this example, we catted a file. But if there was another command, like for example, you could do for file in and then have an ls command here in the back quotes, and then you'd have a for loop that iterated over each file that your ls command returned. So let's look at that user list file here. Alright, we can see it has test1, test2, test3, test4. So when we run this for loop 2, it's going to say for user in, it's going to cat this file, get these results back, and then iterate the loop 4 times over what was in that file. So let's go ahead and run that. And as you can see, for each of the 4 things in the file, it ran the code in the block right here for the for loop for each of the items in the file. Alright, so that's pretty straightforward. Let's look at a couple more examples here. Alright, and so like this one shows another example of running an external command to get our list. So here we're saying for user in, and then we have the back ticks here. So what's going to happen is when this is run, the first thing the shell is going to do is run what's in the back quotes. And what this will do is cat etc password awk field separators print $1. What this does, we can go ahead and run that, is it just returns a list of the users on the system, basically the first column in etc password. Let's pull back up that for loop. So it's going to go for user in, basically every user on the system, that's what's in the quotes, And for every user on the system, run this block of code, which is just our id command. So let's go ahead and run that and see what happens. Alright, you can see, we can scroll up here, you can see it went through all the users on the system and ran the code in the loop for them. Alright, let's look at a couple more examples here. Okay, this is an example of a nested for loop. What a nested for loop is basically when you have a loop within inside a loop. So you can see here we have a for loop, and then within that for loop we have another for loop. And one thing I didn't mention before, but I should probably mention now, is notice the indentation here. So everything under this for loop here, we have indented one tab, and then when we created another for loop, we indented what was under that for loop another tab. And this is just done to make it easier to read the script. The shell itself doesn't care about this white space here, and it'll work just fine if you leave all this white space out. It just makes it a lot harder to read. So you really want to, follow best practice and indent here. Just do a tab over for everything under this first for loop. And if you do nested for loops or an if statement or something under here, do another tab to show that, so you can do a quick glance and see where everything falls in your code. Alright, so nested for loops. All they are is a loop within inside a loop. So in this example, this is just a real basic example. We have the first for loop where we are going to set the number variable, the first time through the loop to 1, then to 2, and then to 3. So this first for loop is going to run a total of 3 times. Now, within this loop, the code that's going to run is going to be another for loop. In this for loop, we're going to have the letter variable. It's going to be set to A, B, C, D, and E each time it loops through this for loop. And so when you have nested for loops like this, basically what's going to happen is, this one's going to run through a total of 3 times for each of the 3 items in this list. And this loop's going to run a total of 5 times since we have 5 items in this list. And so when they're nested like this, the total times that this command here will be run is going to be 15 times. And that's because 3 items in this list times 5 items in this list, because we're going to run this for loop basically once per each of the items in the upper for loop. So when we run this, what we're going to see is the first time through, number will be set to 1, and then it'll run this nested for loop, and letter will be set to A, B, C, D, and E while the number is 1. And in this for loop it will increment to 2, and it'll rerun this for loop, and while number is 2, it'll display A, B, C, D, and E again for 5 times for each number 2. It might be easier if I just run it so you can see what happens. So we'll run for loop 4.sh, and you can see we had basically the numbers here are the first for loop, and the letters are that second for loop. And you can see when basically when it ran this first for loop, we had 1, the number set to 1, and then it had A, B, C, D, and E, and then we incremented the number 1, through this for loop we went to number 2, and that would be this section right here, and then 3 for the last. So you can just see basically it ran through this command here 15 total times due to the way the loops were nested. Now you might be asking, well, when would this be useful to do? Why would you want to do a nested for loop? Well, let me show you some just an example of when you might want to do this. And this is just pseudocode. This code wouldn't actually work. It's just an example just of when you might want to do a nested for loop. So let's say our first for loop here, we would set the variable to be VM host. So we're assuming we're in like some kind of VM environment, and we'd want the VM host for loop to run. We'd have to have a command here to get a list of all the VM hosts. So let's say in this example there's 10 VM hosts, and on each of those 10 VM hosts there's 20 VMs per host. So basically the first for loop, we'd have a command to get a list of the hosts, the VM host, and then the code in here would run for each of those hosts. And what we're going to do is have a nested for loop in there where we would be able to have another command here where you list out and say, give me a list of all the VMs on a specific VM host, because VM host, the variable here will be set to one VM host per this first for loop. And then within this part right here, you basically have, it would run for every VM on each of the VMs that are on the 10 hosts. So basically, if we had 10 VM host, 20 VMs per host, this line right here would run 200 times. So this would be one example where you could have, like right here, have a command to start all the VMs on each of the VM hosts or whatever. So this is to get you thinking about where you might want to look at nested for loops. Basically where you have cases where you can get one item, and then that item will have sub-items underneath it, like a VM host to VM relationship. Well, you can just nest loops in there so you can iterate through every item using these kind of nested for loops. Alright, the last thing I want to cover is running one-line ad hoc for loops directly on the command line, just as part of your day-to-day working in the shell. And that's really easy to do. Basically, let's do an example where we do some kind of loop to iterate over some files. So we could say for file in ls, we'll say for loop star do echo $file. Done. Alright, so this should look very familiar to the for loops we've been covering that are in the form of a shell script file. Big difference is, it's all in one line, and the way you have to separate things when it's all in one line like this is you do your for loop like you normally would, and then you put a semicolon right here, and then you put your do, and then you just start putting the commands you want to be run, in the do loop. And then you can list multiple commands here. You just separate them by a semicolon. And then the last thing you do is you put a semicolon and you put the word done to end the loop. Alright? So the key things to remember is the semicolon. You put a semicolon after the for loop to get it started. You put the word do, and then you start listing your commands. Now notice the do, the common thing people do is they put a semicolon after the do command here. Well, that's not going to work. You'll get a syntax error. So you want to make sure you put a semicolon here, but not after do, and then you start listing the commands you want to run after there. So if we try this, you can see that works as expected. Now, that wasn't too useful because all we did was just display the file name, but let's make it a little bit more useful. Let's say we wanted to back up all these files, Well, we could easily do that. We could say copy file, and we could say $. I'm going to put this in brackets so that it basically the brackets works, because what we're going to do is, if we didn't put brackets around this file variable, it would think the file underscore backup was all the same variable, and it wouldn't be able to find it. So what we do is we put file in these brackets. Since there's not a space, it's all continuous. Alright, so what this is going to do, and notice I left the word echo on here, because what I want to do is see what the command line is going to generate is before I actually run it. So what it should show us is, for every file it finds matching, this ls command, it should show us the command to copy the file to file underscore backup. Alright, you can see that worked, It's going to copy for loop to for loop 1.sh underscore backup. And since we had the echo on there, it didn't actually do anything. It just showed it to the screen. So what we can do now that we made sure that looks correct is just take off the echo, run it, and then let's see if that works. Yeah, you can see now we have a underscore backup for all the files. So that's just an example of how you can do a quick one-line command here to quickly rename files. You can use this for really anything you're having to repeat over and over again where it's the same command, you can usually transform that into a for loop and save yourself a lot of time. Because in this example we only had 5 files, but what if you needed to make a backup of 1,000 files? The for loop is going to really make that quick and easy. And I would always